There is a type of person who feels everything, and the world uses that against them until they feel nothing at all. And here's what nobody tells you: the silence that follows isn't peace, it isn't healing. It is the sound of something dying inside a person who was once extraordinary. Stay with me, because what happens next in the neurology, the psychology, the very architecture of the self is something you need to understand completely if you have ever felt too much, loved too hard, and been punished for. This speech is the explanation you never received and the warning you desperately need right now. Let's be precise about what we're talking about, because the word empath gets thrown around in casual conversation as though it's a personality quirk, like preferring tea over coffee or enjoying long walks. It is not that, not even close. An empath, in the deepest psychological sense, is a person whose nervous system is calibrated with extraordinary sensitivity to the emotional and psychological states of others. This is not metaphor, this is neurobiology. The mirror neuron systems in the brain, those remarkable neural structures that allow human beings to simulate the experiences of other people internally, appear to function with heightened reactivity in individuals who identify as deeply empathic. What this means practically is that when someone near you is in pain, you do not merely observe their pain the way a geologist observes a rock formation. You feel it. You feel it as though it is happening in your own body, your own chest, your own throat. This is an extraordinary capacity, and like all extraordinary capacities, it comes with an extraordinary cost. Think about this seriously. Imagine that you possess a form of perception that most people do not have access to, a kind of emotional radar that registers frequencies others simply cannot detect. You walk into a room and you know without being told that something is wrong. You sit across from a person who is smiling, and something in you senses that the smile is a mask. And behind the mask, there is grief or rage or shame. You feel the tension in a relationship before a single word of conflict has been spoken. You feel the loneliness of the person standing alone at the edge of every social gathering. Now, here's the question you must confront: what does the world do with a person like that? The answer, in far too many cases, is that the world exploits them. Not always consciously, not always maliciously, but reliably, consistently, and with devastating effect. Part 2: Why Empaths Are Targeted. The Psychology of Exploitation. There is a type of person in the world, and you need to understand this clearly. Who is drawn to sensitivity the way a parasite is drawn to a host. Now, I want to be careful here, because the word parasite sounds dramatic, but I'm using it in a precise sense. A psychological parasite is someone who consciously or unconsciously extracts emotional resources from another person without reciprocating. They consume empathy, they consume attention, patience, forgiveness, and care, and they consume it from the people most willing to give it. Who is most willing to give it? The empath, of course. The empath will give you the benefit of the doubt when no reasonable. The empath will apologize when they have done nothing wrong, because they have absorbed your discomfort and interpreted it as their own failure. The empath will remain in situations that are destroying them because they can feel your need, and they cannot bring themselves to abandon someone in need. This is not weakness. Let me be absolutely clear about that. This is not weakness. This is a kind of structural vulnerability that arises from one of humanity's most noble capacities, the capacity for compassion. The tragedy here is not that empaths are naive or foolish. The tragedy is that their greatest strength is precisely what makes them most susceptible to harm. And the harm comes. It always comes. It may come from a romantic partner who learns quickly that emotional manipulation works on you like a key in a lock. It may come from a parent who used your sensitivity as a dumping ground for their own unprocessed anguish. It may come from a friendship, a workplace, a community, any system where one person's need consistently outweighs another person's limits. But it comes. And when it comes repeatedly, when the hurt is not a single wound, but a sustained campaign of small violations, something begins to happen inside you that is far more complex and far more dangerous than simple sadness. Part 3: the first internal response: hypervigilance and the threat map. The first thing that happens internally when an empath is hurt repeatedly is the construction of what psychologists call a threat map. Your nervous system, that ancient, extraordinary biological system that evolved over millions of years to keep you alive, begins to treat the social environment the way a soldier treats a minefield. Every interaction becomes a potential detonation, Every silence from someone you care about becomes evidence of incoming rejection. Every raised eyebrow, every delayed text message, every shift in tone becomes data to be analyzed for signs of danger. This is called hypervigilance, and it is exhausting in a way that people who have not experienced it genuinely cannot comprehend. Imagine running a complex threat assessment algorithm in the background of every single conversation you have every single day. Imagine never being fully present in a moment because part of your mind is constantly scanning for the thing that will hurt you next. Imagine being at a party, surrounded by people who love you, and being unable to access the simple pleasure of that because your nervous system is decided based on substantial historical evidence that people are dangerous. The cruel irony here is profound. The empath, who was designed by nature to connect, who lives most fully when they are in genuine connection with others, becomes increasingly incapable of the very thing they need most because connection requires a degree of vulnerability, and vulnerability at this stage feels like suicide. The nervous system does not care about your values. It does not care about your philosophy or your spiritual practice or your sincere desire to love and be loved. The nervous system cares about survival. And if the data it has collected tells it that openness leads to pain, it will begin to close you down automatically, involuntarily, without your conscious consent. This is not a character flaw. This is biology doing exactly what it was designed to do. But it is devastating, and it is only the beginning. Part 4, the collapse of emotional boundaries. When you stop knowing where you end, here is something that is rarely discussed with the seriousness it deserves. The repeatedly hurt empath often loses the ability to distinguish between their own emotions and the emotions they have absorbed from others. Think about what that means. You have, over time, spent so much of your energy attending to the emotional states of others, reading them, absorbing them, responding to them, that you have gradually, almost imperceptibly, neglected the project of understanding your own interior. You've been so focused on what they need, what they feel, what they might do, that the question of what you need, what you feel, what you want has become almost unanswerable. Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychiatrist, described the self as the totality of the psyche, the organizing principle of the personality. The project of becoming a complete human being, what Jung called individuation, requires that you develop a clear and honest relationship with your own self. Not the self that other people need you to be, not the self that earns love through service and sacrifice, but the actual, authentic, complex self with its desires and its darkness, its gifts and its grievances. The repeatedly hurt empath has often abandoned this project entirely, not because they lack the intelligence or the depth to pursue it, but because every time they turned their attention inward, some external need reached out and pulled them back. And after enough of this, after enough years of being the emotional caretaker, the peacemaker, the one who holds everything together, they have simply lost the thread. They no longer know who they are separate from their function. They no longer know what they feel separate from what they were taught to feel. And this is a form of psychological dissolution that carries genuine clinical weight. In the language of modern trauma psychology, we might call this self-concept fragmentation. The coherent narrative of who you are, your identity, has been destabilized by repeated experiences of having your emotional reality invalidated, minimized, or weaponized against you. And when the self-concept fragments, the consequences are serious. Part 5. The emotional blunting. When the sensitivity begins to die, now we arrive at perhaps the most devastating stage, and I want you to sit with this one, because it is the stage that most people miss, including the empath themselves. After sustained emotional injury, the sensitivity begins to shut down, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, like a light dimming rather than a light being switched off. You begin to notice that you don't feel things the way you used to. The things that once moved you deeply, a piece of music, a story of human suffering, the beauty of something small and true, begin to register at a lesser intensity. The care you once had for people becomes effortful, where it was once effortless. The compassion that defined you begins to feel like a performance rather than a living reality. This is called emotional numbing, and in the psychological literature, it is frequently associated with complex trauma, specifically with the kind of repeated relational trauma that does not come from a single catastrophic event, but from a sustained pattern of emotional harm within close relationships. The numbing is, in a very real sense, the nervous system's final mercy to you. When the pain reaches a threshold that the system cannot manage, it begins to modulate your sensitivity downward. It is the same mechanism that causes physical shock in the body after severe injury, a protective flooding of analgesic chemicals that prevents the pain signal from overwhelming the system entirely. But here is the problem. The numbing is not selective. It does not say, I will shut down the capacity for pain while preserving the capacity for joy. It does not say, I will close the door to suffering while keeping the window open to love. The numbing is comprehensive. The same neural pathways that register grief register wonder. The same emotional architecture that makes you capable of profound sorrow is the architecture that makes you capable of profound love, profound awe, profound connection. When one goes quiet, so does the other. And the empath who has built their entire identity on the richness of their emotional life finds themselves in a landscape they do not recognize, a landscape that is gray and muffled and strangely distant. And they wonder if they're broken. And they wonder if they will ever feel anything real again. The answer is yes, but only if you understand what is happening clearly enough to respond correctly. And most people do not understand it at all. If this is striking something true inside you, share it immediately with someone who needs to hear it. Drop one word in the comments that describes what you felt when you first realized the world was draining you. Subscribe right now because the rest of this conversation is the part most people never reach. Your silence isn't peace. And the next section is where we prove it. There is a psychological process that occurs in people who have been repeatedly harmed by those they loved, and it is one of the most sinister and least understood mechanisms of relational trauma. It is called the internalization of the aggressor, and it works like this. When a person who is significant to you, a parent, a partner, a close friend, repeatedly communicates through words or through behavior that your sensitivity is a problem, that your feelings are excessive, that your needs are too much, that your perception of reality is distorted, your mind begins to believe it, not because you are weak, not because you are stupid, but because the mind, in its attempt to maintain relationship and predict behavior, will often adopt the beliefs of the dominant person in a dyad. It is a survival strategy. It is the mind saying, if I internalize their worldview, I can anticipate their reactions and protect myself. The result is that the empath develops an internal critic, a voice inside their own head that uses the language of their abuser, a voice that says, you are too sensitive, you overreact, you are too much. No one will ever be able to handle you. The fact that you are in pain right now is your own fault because you feel too deeply and you expect too much. And the devastating part, the part that makes this mechanism so psychologically corrosive, is that this voice does not announce itself as foreign. It does not say, hello, I am the internalized voice of someone who harmed you. It sounds like your own thoughts. It sounds like self-awareness. It sounds like hard-won wisdom. And so you trust it, and you use it against yourself with more precision and cruelty than any external critic ever could. This is why the repeatedly hurt empath often becomes their own worst enemy, not through any original malice or self-destructive impulse, but because the machinery of their own extraordinarily sensitive mind has been turned, through sustained relational trauma, against itself. At some point, and this point always comes, the repeatedly hurt empath begins to withdraw. This withdrawal is often mistaken by the people around them for coldness, for indifference, sometimes even for cruelty. The person who was once always available, always present, always the first to reach out, becomes quiet, becomes distant, cancels plans, stops initiating, responds to messages with monosyllables where there were once paragraphs. And the people around them say, what happened to you? You've changed. You're different. You're not who you used to be. And they are right. Something has changed, but they have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the change. The withdrawal is not indifference. It is self-preservation. It is the psyche finally, after years of open doors and broken promises, deciding that it must close the gates. It is the empath learning at enormous cost, not that openness without discernment is not virtue. It is a doorway through which harm enters again and again unchallenged. The tragedy is that this lesson often arrives too late, or is learned in too blunt a way because the empath, having no practice at protecting themselves, having spent a lifetime in the service of others' emotional needs, does not know how to set boundaries with precision. They do not know how to say, I will allow this and I will not allow that. They only know how to be fully open or to be fully closed. There is no middle register. The dial goes from 10 to 0. And in the closed state, they lose things of genuine value. They lose the depth of connection that was before all of this their greatest joy. They lose the ability to give freely, which was the expression of their most essential nature. They become smaller than they were designed to be, quieter, more defended, more alone. And the loneliness that follows is of a particular acute variety because the empath and withdrawal is not lonely because they lack people. They may be surrounded by people. They are lonely because they cannot access those people in the way they once could. The very capacity that made connection possible, the deep, open, vulnerable attunement to another human being, is now behind walls. And they built those walls, and they are right to have built them, and they grieve every stone. Who am I if I am not the person who feels everything? This is the question that haunts the repeatedly hurt empath in the quiet hours, because their identity, the story they have told themselves about who they are and what they are for, has been built largely on their capacity to feel, to care, to connect, and now that capacity is compromised. Now the sensitivity is behind glass. Now the care feels conditional and rationed where it was once abundant and unconditional, and so the identity question opens up like a fault line. If I am not the one who nurtures, who am I? If I am not the one who forgives, who am I? If I am not the one who stays even when staying costs everything, who am I? This is the existential dimension of what happens internally when an empath is hurt repeatedly. It is not merely emotional. It is not merely neurological. It is a crisis of meaning, a crisis of self-conception, a fracturing of the narrative that gives a life coherence and direction. And here I want to say something that is difficult to hear, but absolutely necessary to understand: the identity that you are grieving. The identity built entirely on emotional service, on care without limits, on love without conditions and without reciprocity, was never a fully healthy identity to begin with. I say this not to diminish your suffering. I say this not to suggest that your compassion was a mistake. Compassion is not a mistake. Compassion is one of the crowning achievements of human development. I say this because the specific configuration of that compassion, unbounded, unprotected, offered to people who had not demonstrated themselves worthy of it, extended even when it was killing you, was a configuration that arose, in most cases, not from pure spiritual generosity, but from a wound. Many empaths became empaths in this extreme and vulnerable way because hypersensitivity to others' emotional states was an adaptive strategy in an early environment where that sensitivity was necessary for survival, where reading a parent's mood accurately was how you avoided punishment, where making yourself indispensable through care was how you avoided punishment, where making yourself indispensable through care was how you secured attachment, where your own emotional needs were unsafe to express, and so you learned to express only the needs of others. The wound is real, the adaptation was intelligent, but you have been carrying a strategy designed for a war that ended years ago, and it is long past time to set it down. Let me be honest with you about something, and I want you to hear this carefully because it goes against the narrative that is usually offered in spaces that discuss empathy and emotional sensitivity. You cannot go back to who you were before. I know that is not what you want to hear. I know there is a version of yourself that you remember, open, warm, radiant, free with your care that you want to recover, and I understand the longing. I understand it deeply, but the path forward is not recovery. It is not regression to a previous state. The path forward is construction, the building of something new, something that incorporates the lessons of your suffering without being defined by the scars. What does this construction look like? It begins with the radical recognition that your sensitivity is not the problem. The lack of discernment was the problem. The inability or the refusal to assess accurately who deserved your care and who did not. The conflation of neediness with worthiness, the equation of suffering with virtue. The belief held often unconsciously that if someone needs you desperately enough, that need itself is a moral claim on your resources. It is not. Let me repeat that. Someone's need is not in itself a moral claim on your resources. You are not obligated by the existence of another person's pain to sacrifice yourself on the altar of their comfort. This is not selfishness. This is the establishment of the basic conditions required for you to function as a human being over the long term. The reconstruction also requires that, and this will be the hardest work you have ever done, the development of what we might call discerning compassion. Compassion that asks questions before it opens. Compassion that observes patterns before it commits. Compassion that says, I care about your suffering and I am willing to help you. But I need to see over time and through behavior rather than words that this is a relationship in which my care is mutual. This is not cynicism, this is wisdom. These are different things, and the difference matters enormously. The final internal process that must occur, and I use the word must deliberately, is the reclamation of the self that was lost in the service of others. This means going back with courage and with honesty to the questions that were never asked. What do I want? Not what do they need from me? Not what would make this situation better for everyone. What do I want? What gives me joy that has nothing to do with my usefulness to another person? What are my values? Not the values that were imposed on me by a system that needed my compliance, but the values that I would choose if I were building a life from nothing. This is the work of individuation, of the becoming of a full person, not a helper, not a healer, not a caretaker or a savior or an emotional infrastructure for other people's psychological systems. A person, complex, contradictory, capable of enormous love, and also capable of saying no, capable of compassion and also capable of self-protection, capable of connection and also capable of solitude that is not loneliness, but genuine chosen quiet. The empath who has been hurt repeatedly and who does this work, who goes down into the depth of what was lost and finds in that darkness the pieces of themselves that were abandoned there, does not emerge as a lesser version of who they were. They emerge as a more complete version, more complex, more rooted, less easily swayed by the needs of others, not because they care less, but because they have finally learned to care about themselves with something approaching the same depth and ferocity they once reserved exclusively for others. This is not a betrayal of sensitivity. This is sensitivity, finally turned inward where it was always needed most. I want to close this part of the conversation by saying something about stakes, because this is not only a personal issue, this is a civilizational issue. The world needs people who can feel, not people who are destroyed by feeling, but people who can feel deeply and function responsibly. People who can register the suffering in a room and respond to it with wisdom rather than compulsion. People who can hold complexity, sit with ambiguity, and refuse the easy answers that most people reach for when the reality becomes uncomfortable. These people, the ones with the genuine capacity for empathy, are a kind of resource, and resources, when they are not replenished, run out. When the people who are most capable of human connection are systematically destroyed by that very capacity, when the ones who feel most are punished most thoroughly for feeling, the entire social ecology suffers a loss that it often cannot name and does not know how to mourn. So, this is not a small thing. The protection of the empath is not a personal therapeutic project, it is a social and moral imperative. Every person with genuine sensitivity who learns to protect that sensitivity without extinguishing it, who learns to give with discernment rather than give without limit, who learns to remain open to the world without being destroyed by it, that person is making a contribution to the human project that goes far beyond the individual. And this is why the healing matters, not just for you, for the people around you who need to encounter a human being who feels things and has not been ruined by feeling them, who loves and has not been annihilated by love, who remained through the hurt, through the withdrawal, through the grief, through the withdrawal, through the grief, through the reconstruction, fundamentally, irreducibly, defiantly human. There is a dimension of meaning that runs through every serious human suffering if you're willing to look at it clearly enough and honestly enough to find it. The repeated hurt was not nothing, it was not wasted. It was not merely the story of what someone did to you or what the world failed to give you or what you lost in the years of caring without reciprocation. It was in part the process by which you were forced, against your will and at great cost, to encounter the limits of an identity that was not fully your own. to discover that the person you had been performing was not the complete person you were capable of becoming. To learn through failure rather than through theory that love without limit is not virtue, but a form of self-erasure disguised as generosity. The Stoics understood something about suffering that our therapeutic culture often forgets. Suffering is not the opposite of growth. Often it is the instrument of it, not because suffering is good, not because the people who hurt you deserved your forgiveness, or that the harm was acceptable, or that you should have endured more of it, but because the wound, if you attend to it with intelligence rather than bitterness, with curiosity rather than resentment, the wound will show you exactly where you were, not yet fully formed exactly where the work remains to be done. And that is not a small gift. That is, in fact, the most important information a human being can receive.